Somewhere in Taiwan right now, a reporter is sitting on a story that Microsoft has not confirmed, does not want you to see, and would very much like to quietly slide past before anyone connects it to something that happened almost 20 years ago. According to a report out of Taiwan's United Daily News, Microsoft is preparing to raise the licensing fees it charges computer makers for. The right to put Windows on new machines, somewhere in the range of 7 to 10%. No press release, no blog post, no confirmation from Redmond at all. Just a report, sourced from inside the supply chain, at the exact moment PC makers are already being crushed by something else entirely. Because here's what makes the timing so brutal. Right now, in 2026, memory prices are exploding. DDR5 costs have surged as much as 70% year over year, with some components spiking well over 100% because the same chip fabs that used to feed the PC industry are now being redirected toward AI servers, where the margins are simply better. Dell has already confirmed price hikes of 15 to 20% on its lineup. Asus confirmed hikes of its own just days before CES 2026, citing, in its own words, cost pressure it had been absorbing for an extended period. Lenovo is reportedly telling customers to lock in orders before prices move again in January. HP, in a move that says everything about where this is headed, has started letting people rent laptops instead of buying them outright. This is an industry already bleeding from a hardware cost wound that has nothing to do with Microsoft at all. And into that wound, if the Taiwanese report holds up, Microsoft is about to pour salt. A software licensing fee increase layered on top of a memory crisis, aimed at the same computer makers who are already telling their own customers that prices are going up. It's a single source report. Microsoft hasn't said a word publicly. Maybe it never happens. Maybe it gets watered down. Maybe it's smaller than reported by the time it actually lands on an OEM's invoice. But the fact that it's even plausible, that nobody in the industry seems shocked by the idea, that's the part worth sitting with. Think about what a hike like that actually touches. Retail copies of Windows 11 already run around $139 for the Home Edition and closer to $200 for Pro. And while OEMs pay a very different, much lower negotiated rate than any retail shopper ever would, that negotiated rate is exactly what a 7 to 10% increase would move. Multiply that across every single machine a company like Dell or Lenovo or HP ships in a year, tens of millions of units, and you're not talking about pocket change. You're talking about a cost that has to go somewhere, and it never goes into the manufacturer's own margin if that manufacturer can help it. It goes onto the sticker price, quietly folded in next to the memory surcharge that's already there, so that by the time you're standing in a store or scrolling a checkout page, you have no way of knowing which part of the increase came from a DRAM shortage and which part came from a software license nobody at Microsoft wanted to talk about publicly. Because there was a moment almost 2 decades ago when the entire PC industry had genuine leverage over Microsoft. Real leverage built by more than 100,000 ordinary customers standing in one place and demanding something different. And if you want to understand why a software licensing hike lands on OEMs today without so much as a fight, you have to go back and look at what happened the last time customers actually tried to use that leverage and what Microsoft did with it. Rewind to February 2007. Dell, at the time, was sliding. Its once dominant direct sales model was losing ground to companies that had figured out retail better than Dell had. And the company needed something, anything, to signal it was still listening to the people actually buying its machines. So Dell launched a website called Idea Storm, an online suggestion box where customers could post ideas and vote them up or down, openly, publicly, in front of everyone. It was framed at the time as an experiment in what people were starting to call Web 2.0, a company opening its product roadmap to the crowd instead of dictating it from a boardroom. Almost immediately, the site got hijacked by a single, overwhelming demand: Linux. Specifically, people wanted Dell to sell desktops and laptops with Linux pre-installed instead of Windows, and they wanted a real distribution, not some stripped-down afterthought. The request didn't trickle in, it flooded in. Within weeks, it became one of the most upvoted ideas on the entire platform, and it kept climbing. By the time Dell could no longer pretend not to notice, more than 130,000 people had thrown their support behind it. That is not a niche internet petition. That is 130,000 actual Dell customers or prospective ones, standing up in a public forum built by Dell itself and telling the company, in effect, "We will buy this machine. We are asking you to build it. All you have to do is say yes." And Dell said yes. In May 2007, the company confirmed it would ship Ubuntu Linux, specifically the 7.04 release known as Feisty Fawn, pre-installed on select consumer desktops and notebooks. A Dell spokesperson framed it plainly at the time, saying the company's philosophy was that when customers win, Dell wins, and that the demand for Linux on the desktop was real and growing. It was, by any honest measure, a landmark moment. The largest PC vendor in the world, cornered into it or not, had just publicly acknowledged that Windows was not the only acceptable answer to the question of what operating system a mainstream computer should run. But here's the part of the story that gets left out whenever this moment gets romanticized. Dell shipped the Linux machines, and the machines sold tens of thousands of units, by some counts around 40,000 systems in the first several months alone. That's not nothing. That's a real viable product line with real revenue behind it. And within about 3 years, Dell had quietly stopped advertising Ubuntu as a consumer option at all. Not banned, not killed outright, just faded from the main storefront, tucked away, hard to find unless you already knew exactly what you were looking for. The official explanation, when anyone bothered to ask, was that the option was too confusing for average buyers, that it wasn't reaching the right audience. The demand from power users never fully disappeared, and years later Dell would lean back into Linux through projects aimed specifically at developers, machines built for people who already knew what they wanted. But the mainstream experiment, the one built on top of 130,000 public votes, was allowed to quietly die. Now, you could read that as simply the market speaking. Maybe most people really did just want Windows. The Petition was a loud minority mistaken for a majority. That's a fair read on its own. But it stops being a fair read the moment you understand what Microsoft's OEM licensing agreements had looked like for the better part of the preceding decade. Because Dell's slow retreat from Linux wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was happening inside a system that had been deliberately engineered to make offering an alternative operating system commercially painful. Go back further, to the 1990s. Microsoft's licensing terms with PC manufacturers at the time included what came to be known, both in courtrooms and in the press, as per-processor licensing. The structure worked like this. Microsoft would offer a computer maker a steep discount, in some cases as much as a 40% reduction, on Windows licensing, but only if that manufacturer agreed. To pay Microsoft a royalty on every single machine it sold, whether or not that machine actually shipped with Windows installed, ship a computer with no operating system at all, or with a competitor's operating system, and you still owed Microsoft money. The alternative was to walk away from the discount entirely and pay full per-processor royalties with no volume relief. It was, functionally, a tax on choosing anyone but Microsoft, baked directly into the cost structure of building a PC. The U.S. Department of Justice found this arrangement anti-competitive enough to specifically restrict it as part of a 1994 consent decree. And it became one of the central pieces of evidence years later in the broader United States versus Microsoft antitrust case, the one that ultimately found the company had illegally maintained its operating system monopoly through exactly this kind of leverage over the hardware makers who depended on it. And per-processor licensing wasn't the only lever. Around that same period, Microsoft's bundling of Internet Explorer directly into Windows became the other half of the antitrust case that would eventually define the company's reputation for a generation. The argument being that Microsoft used its control over the operating system. OEMs had no real alternative to make sure its own browser started every single new PC already installed, already the default, already ahead of any competitor before that competitor. Even got a chance to be discovered. European regulators reached similar conclusions years later over Windows Media Player, and later still, over the browser question again, eventually forcing Microsoft to offer European users a browser choice screen. None of that history is really about browsers, though. It's about what Microsoft was willing to do with the leverage it held over the one piece of software every OEM absolutely could not ship a mainstream PC without. That's the environment Dell and every other major OEM had been operating inside for years before IdeaStorm ever existed. By 2007, the most openly punitive versions of that licensing structure were gone, reined in by regulators and lawsuits. But the underlying relationship, Microsoft as the gatekeeper, OEMs as dependents who needed Windows far more than Windows needed any single OEM, never actually changed. It just got quieter. And quiet leverage, it turns out, is just as effective as loud leverage, maybe more effective, because it never gives you a headline-worthy villain moment to rally against. There's no consent decree for a company simply choosing year after year not to make the alternative easy. So when 130,000 people demanded Linux on IdeaStorm, and Dell delivered it, and it slowly withered anyway, ask yourself what incentive Dell actually had to fight for that product line's survival. Every Windows machine Dell sold came with the relationship it already had with Microsoft intact, familiar, predictable, bundled with marketing co-funding and technical support and all the quiet conveniences that decades of partnership build up. Every Ubuntu machine Dell sold was, by comparison, a small act of friction against its biggest and most important software supplier. You don't need an explicit threat for that math to discourage a company. You just need the asymmetry to exist, and it did, and honestly, it still does. If you want the clearest, most undeniable proof that Microsoft understood exactly how dangerous a serious Linux threat could be to its business, you don't have to speculate about Dell's internal incentives at all. You just have to look at what happened 2 years later, when Linux stopped being a niche request on a suggestion website and started actually winning in the market on its own. In 2007, Asus released a strange little laptop called the EEPC. Small, cheap, underpowered by the standards of the time, and running not Windows but a customized build of Xandros Linux. It was supposed to be a minor product. Instead, it sold out repeatedly, sparked an entire new hardware category that the industry started calling netbooks, and did something Microsoft could not ignore. It proved that a huge number of ordinary people were perfectly happy running Linux, as long as the machine was cheap enough and the software got out of their way. Other manufacturers piled in. For a stretch of time in 2007 and 2008, Linux-based netbooks were a genuine, visible, mainstream retail success story, sitting on store shelves next to Windows machines, and in a lot of cases, outselling them at the low end. Microsoft's response tells you everything. Windows XP was, by that point, supposed to be retired, already being phased out in favor of Vista. Microsoft brought it back from the dead specifically for this segment, and didn't just make it available, but priced it aggressively low, steeply discounted for OEMs building machines under a strict set of low-spec limits, small screens, limited. Storage, modest memory, essentially drawing a box around exactly the netbook category and pricing Windows to make sure nothing running Linux could outcompete it on cost anymore. Within about a year, the numbers flipped entirely. Machines that had launched running Linux almost across the board were, by 2009, overwhelmingly shipping with Windows XP instead, because Microsoft made absolutely sure that choosing Linux to save money no longer saved anyone any money at all. Think about what that actually represents. Microsoft, a company that had spent years insisting Windows was worth a premium, was suddenly willing to gut its own margins to zero on an entire hardware category, purely because Linux had shown up and started winning. That's not the behavior of a company that views Linux as harmless. That's the behavior of a company that ran the numbers, recognized an existential threat to its OEM revenue model, and moved fast and aggressively to strangle it before it could compound. Microsoft didn't beat Linux netbooks on quality or on user experience. It beat them on price, because price was the only lever Microsoft controlled that Linux, free and open, could never be undercut on if Microsoft was willing to eat the cost. And once the threat receded, once Windows had reclaimed the netbook category and Linux had been pushed back to the margins, guess what happened to those aggressive discounts? They didn't stay generous forever. Over the following years, as the netbook category itself faded out and got replaced by other form factors, Microsoft's terms for that segment tightened right back up. Screen size restrictions narrowed. Pricing crept upward again, because the emergency that had justified giving Windows away nearly for free was over. The discount was never a gift. It was a defensive maneuver, deployed exactly as long as it was needed and not one day longer. That pattern didn't stay in the past either. It repeated again, almost beat for beat, a few years later, when tablets became the next battlefield. Around 2012 and 2013, as Windows tried to compete in a tablet market being defined by cheap Android hardware and Apple's iPad, OEMs started grumbling publicly about just how much of a tablet's retail price was being eaten up by the Windows license itself. Acer's own president said as much on the record, pointing out that a big chunk of the price gap between a Windows tablet and a comparable notebook or Android device came down almost entirely to the operating system license, not the hardware underneath it. That's not an outside critic making an accusation. That's one of Microsoft's own OEM partners, saying it out, loud, that Windows licensing was making Microsoft's hardware partners less competitive in a market Microsoft desperately wanted to win. Ahead of that particular launch, industry sources at Computex in Taipei had already pegged the license fee Microsoft was charging vendors for Windows RT, the ARM-based version built specifically for tablets, at somewhere between $80 and $95 a unit, a number high enough on its own to push finished tablet pricing well past what Android competitors were charging for comparable hardware. It's almost the same city, almost the same supply chain, and almost the same complaint you're hearing again in 2026, a licensing number nobody outside the industry ever sees officially, surfacing first through manufacturers who have to actually absorb it. Then Chromebooks showed up, and the whole cycle ran one more time. Cheap, Linux kernel-based Chrome OS devices started eating into the budget end of the PC market around 2013, growing fast enough that analysts were tracking it as a real structural threat, not a fad. Microsoft's answer was, once again, to cut the price of Windows itself. Reports at the time described licensing fees. for low-cost devices getting slashed by as much as 70% for machines retailing under $250, specifically engineered to close the cost gap with Chromebooks. Microsoft went even further, rolling out a stripped-down edition nicknamed Windows with Bing, essentially trading a chunk of the licensing fee for default search placement instead, monetizing the OEM relationship a different way, rather than losing it outright. And just like the netbook era before it, once Microsoft judged the Chromebook threat to be overstated, once European sales data suggested the panic had been bigger than the reality, those same discounted licenses started getting restricted again. Tighter screen size caps, small upward creep in price, sourced directly from PC maker contacts describing Microsoft as having, in their words, over-egged its response and pulled some of it back. Every single time in this story, the pattern is identical. A real alternative shows up. Linux, in one form or another, whether it's a customer petition, a netbook, or a Chromebook, starts winning real customers away from Windows on price, on simplicity, on principle, on whatever the moment calls for. Microsoft responds by making Windows artificially cheap for exactly the OEMs and exactly the hardware segment under threat, for exactly as long as the threat looks serious. And then, once the alternative gets pushed back to the margins again, once the emergency has passed and the headlines have moved on, the discounts quietly tighten, the fees quietly climb, and the industry that just spent a year or two being protected from Linux finds itself paying full price again, or more. Which brings us back to where we started, to a single-sourced report out of Taiwan claiming a fresh 7 to 10% increase in Windows OEM licensing fees, landing in the middle of 2026. At the exact moment, PC makers are already reeling from a memory price crisis that has nothing to do with Microsoft. If that report is accurate, ask yourself honestly what threat, if any, is currently keeping Microsoft's OEM pricing in check the way Linux threats used to. And the answer, uncomfortably, might be less than there used to be. Because here's the part of this story that should genuinely worry anyone still hoping for a repeat of 2007. Windows OEM licensing, as a share of what Microsoft actually cares about, has been shrinking for years. Windows itself now sits inside the smallest of Microsoft's three main reporting segments, dwarfed by cloud infrastructure and, increasingly, by the enormous capital being poured into AI. When a division that big pulls back from being your company's center of gravity, the incentive to protect its OEM relationships with soft-touch pricing and generous discounts shrinks right along with it. In 2013, Microsoft cut Windows pricing by 70% because losing the low end of the PC market mattered enormously to a company that still saw Windows as its core identity. Back then, Windows was still close to the center of how the company defined itself in public, in earnings calls, and its own marketing. Today, when Microsoft talks about where it's pointing its money and its attention, the conversation is almost entirely about cloud infrastructure and about the data centers being built specifically to train and run AI models. Investments measured in the tens of billions of dollars on a scale the Windows licensing business hasn't operated at in years. In 2026, does it matter nearly as much? If a chunk of OEM revenue quietly firms up or rises while Windows itself keeps losing relative importance inside Microsoft's business, that's not a company under threat making a defensive move. That's a company treating a legacy cash cow as exactly that, a cash cow, squeezed a little harder because there's less reason left to protect it. And that's exactly what makes the title of this video not just a clever hook, but a genuinely fair conclusion. Microsoft learned nothing from the Dell Linux petition, not in the sense that it forgot the event happened, but in the sense that the actual lesson on offer, that customers wanted real choice, that OEMs could build a viable business around something other than Windows, that price and dependency were the only real levers keeping the ecosystem locked in place, was never absorbed as a reason to change behavior. It was absorbed as a threat response case study. React fast, cut price, win back the market, then quietly restore the old terms once nobody's watching anymore. Rinse, repeat for almost 20 straight years. Here's the part that should actually give you some hope, though, and it's worth sitting with before we wrap this up. The conditions that made the Dell petition possible haven't gone away. If anything, they're stronger now than they were in 2007. Take Steam Deck. Valve shipped a handheld gaming device running a Linux-based operating system, SteamOS, into a market everyone assumed belonged to Windows by default, because that's simply how PC gaming had always worked. It didn't just survive, it became one of the most successful pieces of PC gaming hardware in years, and it did it by proving at scale in front of millions of players that a well-executed Linux-based system with strong Windows game compatibility built in through Valve's Proton layer could deliver an experience good enough that most people never even noticed or cared that Windows wasn't underneath it. That's not a hobbyist curiosity anymore. That's commercial proof. running in living rooms and backpacks all over the world, that the operating system, underneath a great product, can quietly stop mattering to the person using it. And it isn't just showing up in handheld gaming devices. StatCounter's own tracking, the same firm whose numbers get cited every single time somebody predicts the year of the Linux desktop and gets laughed at for it, has quietly kept climbing. Global desktop Linux share was sitting under 2% as recently as 2019. It crossed 3% in 2023, passed 4% in early 2024, and by mid-2025 had reached just over 5% of the entire US desktop market, according to StatCounter's own published figures, ahead of Chrome OS outright and closing in on being a genuinely mainstream fourth option next to Windows and the two flavors of Mac OS. Analysts covering that climb point to the exact same forces we've been talking about this whole video. Valve's gaming push through Proton and Steam Deck, distributions that have gotten dramatically friendlier to install and use than anything available in 2007. And more recently, a wave of people looking for somewhere else to go as Windows 10 support wound down. None of. That happened because Microsoft handed it to anyone. It happened in spite of Microsoft, built by an open source community and a handful of companies willing to bet on it at exactly the moment OEM licensing costs are reportedly about to climb again. Or take Framework, a laptop maker built around modularity and long-term repairability, the opposite philosophy of disposable hardware. Framework treats Linux, specifically distributions like Fedora and Ubuntu, as fully first-class options on its machines, not an unsupported afterthought you install at your own risk, but something the company actively documents, tests, and stands behind. It's a small company next to Dell or Lenovo, sure, but it's proof that an OEM can build a real, functioning, even beloved consumer hardware business without treating Windows as the only legitimate default. And notably, Framework isn't immune to what's happening in 2026 either. It's one of the manufacturers already flagged as raising prices alongside Dell, squeezed by the same memory costs everyone else is facing, which is its own reminder that even the companies most willing to offer you a real alternative to Windows still have to survive inside a hardware market Microsoft doesn't fully control, but very much still shapes. So where does that leave things? If the Taiwanese report is right, and Microsoft really is about to quietly raise what it charges OEMs at the exact moment those same OEMs are already passing hardware cost increases onto you, the lesson of the Dell Linux petition isn't a nostalgic story about a company that briefly listened before going back to business as usual. It's a live, current, entirely relevant warning about what happens when an entire industry lets one company's software licensing terms remain the quiet, unquestioned cost of doing business year after year, decade after decade, with no real organized pushback ever forcing a permanent change instead of a temporary one. 130,000 people in 2007 proved that real, sustained customer pressure could move one of the largest computer makers on Earth to build and ship an alternative. It worked. And then it was allowed to fade, not because it failed, but because nobody kept the pressure on long enough to make the change stick. If you're in the market for a new machine this year, and a chunk of that price tag turns out to be a Windows license that just got quietly more expensive on top of memory costs that are already spiking, it's worth remembering that you are not actually stuck. Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Pop Potting, OS, and a dozen other genuinely polished, genuinely usable options exist today in a state of maturity that simply didn't exist back in 2007, running on hardware that, thanks to companies like Framework and the enormous compatibility work behind projects like Proton, is more ready for it than it has ever been. The petition already happened once. It moved the industry, briefly. The only real question left is whether enough people are willing to make that kind of noise again, or whether Microsoft has correctly bet that, this time, nobody will bother. Because that's really the bet underneath all of this. Not that Linux is worse, not that Windows is better, but that inertia beats every alternative on its own, quietly, without Microsoft ever having to say a word about it in public. 130,000 signatures moved Dell for a few years. A cheap, well-built Linux netbook moved the entire industry's pricing for about 18 months. A handheld game console moved a market Microsoft assumed it would own forever. Every one of those moments proved the leverage was real. None of them proved it was permanent, because permanence was never something Microsoft was going to hand. Over voluntarily, it was always going to have to be taken and held on purpose for longer than the last time. If this new licensing hike turns out to be real, that's the choice sitting in front of the entire PC industry again. Whether to treat it as one more line item to quietly absorb, or as the reminder it actually is, that the last time enough people said something, the largest computer maker on the planet listened, if only for a little while.